Hello everybody and welcome to my spoiler review of Joker Folie, Deux. If you haven't seen my non-spoiler review or if you haven't seen the movie, you can click up in the corner because I am going to be jumping right into spoilers about the film, which came out yesterday, and it is already a topic of hot discussion, hot conversation, and a lot of negative conversation. I went back, I saw it a second time, I wrote down some more observations, and so I want to really dive into the movie now with full spoilers. So this is your last warning if you don't want to know anything about the Joker sequel. So I did go back and watch the movie a second time, and I was expecting for the things that I didn't like to stand out even more than they did the first time I saw the film, but strangely, and I know completely opposite to how a lot of people are reacting to this movie, I walked away liking the movie a little bit more. Now, that's not to say that I don't think it has critical errors in it, which we will talk about, but I am certainly not as negative on this movie as a lot of people are. There is a dog pile going on with this film, and I'm not saying that anyone is doing it disingenuously, but there is kind of an energy that you can feel, especially with a movie at this scale, when it fails to meet expectations, where there's just a feeding frenzy. There is blood in the water, and there's absolutely blood in the water with Joker Folie Deux right now. So when we talk about the audience reaction, I think it is tied in heavily to audience expectation. What were people expecting? What were they looking for when they were walking into this? And I think that's probably the fundamental question at the core of the response to the film. For people who were expecting a deeper exploration of the comic book character or the Joker lore, this movie's absolutely not that, and I'm not absolving Todd Phillips from this. I think it was a huge mistake to include the Waynes and to include those direct tie-ins to the Batman mythology in the first Joker movie, because I think it set up perhaps some false expectations to what the sequel was going to be, because if you kill Batman's parents in the first movie, it's logical to think that you're going to follow that through line in the second movie. But I think when you look at the movie overall, it's not completely separate from the overall Batman mythology. Harley Quinn, or Lee, is basically at the stage at the end of the movie where we see her or meet her in a lot of the comic books. Harvey Dent has been critically injured in the explosion at the courthouse, and I made sure to pay special attention to when we see him on the ground, and you can see that half of his face has wounds and damage to it, so you could say, okay, well, now you're going down the road of Two-Face. We may have seen the birth of the Batman version of the Joker, and then when you look at it from a timeline perspective, we're still kind of a ways off from when Batman would show up, and one of the things that's been consistent across a lot of Batman mythology is that he enters crime fighting in Gotham City at a time when the city is basically at a point of no return. Things have gotten so bad that he feels like he has to go out there and clean up the streets, and I think that really this movie is the beginning of that tipping point. This is where Gotham went from a city with urban decay and crime to a city that is completely irredeemable, the kind of city that needs a guy in a bat suit to go out there and clean up the streets because nothing else works. In a way, it's an origin story for Gotham City. Yeah, they should make a TV show about that. You can call it Gotham. That's a great idea. And really, I think this movie did some things that weren't that much different from some of the things that we saw with Gotham, including how they treated the character of the Joker, where one version inspires a different version. Now, you can definitely make the argument that that is derivative. And I don't think that that's an invalid argument at all. But I think that there are a lot of reactions that are saying like, well, this doesn't even have anything to do with Batman or Gotham City. I think that it does, and it does have something to do with the Joker, but it's not exactly what people thought they were going to get. And again, I think you have to put a little bit of that on the first movie. And thematically, I think this entire film leads up to this idea that Arthur Fleck as a person is really unimportant. He's not a critical player in the future of Gotham City, but what he represents is what inspires Gotham City to become what it eventually will be. And when you look at how the movie sets that up and how it establishes it, thematically, I don't think that there's a betrayal in the arc of the movie from beginning to end. It's just unconventional and not necessarily where people would think that the story's going to go. I honestly thought this direction was a little more interesting than just making Arthur Fleck the comic book Joker, but it's also risky. And it seems that to a lot of people that risk hasn't paid off. And part of the reasoning for that comes down to either the studio completely mismanaging expectations, or the studio, Todd Phillips, Joaquin Phoenix, etc., making a film that they knew was going to provoke this kind of reaction, but feeling so strongly about it that they did it anyway. However, I have a very hard time believing that this version of Warner Brothers, David Zaslav's Warner Brothers, would spend $190+ million on a movie that they know going in is going to piss people off. So let's jump into more specifics with the movie, and let's start with the first thing we see, which is the cartoon that opens the film. And honestly, I thought that it was completely unnecessary, that it was self-indulgent. I guess maybe it was a reference to the old Looney Tunes things that used to open up Warner Brothers releases, the cartoon shorts before your feature presentation. But I don't think that it said anything that wasn't established in the text of the movie itself. It was about Joker as the shadow who locks Arthur away, but when it comes time to pay the price for everything, Arthur's the one that ends up bloody on the ground saying, knock knock, which is a loop to the end of the movie with the knock knock joke. I get it. I get what the cartoon was saying, but the movie says that anyway. And this was really what I think was the movie's first major misstep. It was a confusing way to open the film, ultimately unnecessary, and I think it starts the audience off on kind of a weird foot. Nobody really knows what to make of the movie, and it just kind of goes on from there. One thing I watched extra closely on my rewatch was how Arthur acts at the beginning of the movie, and it seemed pretty evident to me that there was no Joker there at all. Now, the lawyers are sitting him down and trying to convince him that he has this split personality because they want to get him acquitted, or they want to get the insanity defense, or the psychologists probably want to write a book or something. But it's all sort of the power of suggestion. Oh, did you see this? Oh, I think maybe you saw that, or did you feel this? Arthur's not saying any of that. It's all being suggested to him. And Joaquin Phoenix actually plays a couple scenes really well that I interpreted as Arthur trying to drag Joker back out of him in order to essentially save his own life. There's the scene in the rain where he's chained up. If you look at it, it looks like he's doing the maniacal Joker laugh, but looking at the choices Phoenix made in the scene, I think he was kind of hysterically crying and desperately trying to coax Joker back out of him. And then we have the scene in the van where he's headed to the trial for the first time, where he's also doing the Joker laugh, but he kind of stops and shakes his head and says, no, that's not quite it. It seems like he's trying to laugh. He's trying to reconnect with that side of himself because he knows that's the only way to save himself. But again, he can't do that because it's just not there anymore. Joker is gone, and every time we see that persona not in a fantasy sequence, it's Arthur giving a performance, which he drops at the very end of the movie. But everybody around him is trying to manipulate him to pull Joker out of him for their own self-interest. And of course, the person doing that the most is Lee, played by Lady Gaga. The musical sequences have been a huge detractor for a lot of people, and I agree that there are way too many of them. I think the movie would have been better served by focusing on a handful of songs instead of the larger number that we see sprinkled throughout the movie. If they'd all landed with the impact of that courtroom number, which is called The Joker, then I think the movie would have at least flowed better. But the songs that they do include in the movie, when you look at the choices, I think they're interesting because when they're Arthur's songs, when you're seeing inside of his head, they all have something to do with Harley and his connection to Harley and teaming up with Harley. But when we see Lee singing, all of her songs, the ones that are coming out of her head, are about herself. I've got the world on a string. If my friends could see me now. It's all about putting the spotlight on her, how she can use Joker to be the center of attention. It's a subtle thing, but I think it does underscore what we know about these characters at the end, which is that Arthur is kind of in this delusion of him and Harley being in love, and Harley is in a delusion where she can use the Joker to become just as famous, to do something with her life. She says that in the movie. I haven't done anything with my life the way that you have. The Joker is her conduit to achieve that goal. And she's really the instigator. She's the one who first gets Arthur to sing, who tells him he's a star, who plants the idea of using music as a fantasy in order to fuel these delusions. She starts the fire in the hospital and immediately leads Arthur and herself outside to the cameras so that she can be seen in his company. She's the one who encourages Arthur to become Joker again, who tells him to stop taking his meds so that he can perhaps get a little destabilized. She's the one who's selling to the media that Joker is a hero, that Arthur doesn't need to be healed. She tells Arthur he needs to fire his lawyer, which he does. It's all in service of elevating her profile through the Joker. The Folie, Deux, the shared delusion that the title refers to, in my mind, isn't in Arthur's head. It's in Lee's head or Harley Quinn's head. The delusion is this life where she gets to run away with Joker, and she draws Arthur into that delusion, which they share until Arthur decides that he can't be the Joker, that he's not the Joker, and then the game's up. I think a really good example of this manipulation is the scene where she comes to visit him at Arkham and he confronts her and says, "You lied to me about all these things." And you can tell that he's kind of on the edge of breaking it off, or he's very troubled, and she starts to sing and he tries to push it away, but eventually she uses this music, this song, this tool, this trigger for delusion to draw him back into that fantasy. And then she ends by drawing the smile on the window, and he comes up and he smiles, and oh, he's the Joker again. So this was an example of her using music as a way to pull Arthur out of himself and back into Joker, and also keep him from walking away from her, because he's really starting to question things. Why are you living in my old building? You say you're pregnant. All of these things were lies. She's able to tamp all of that down by appealing to this delusion that she's pulled Arthur into. It would appear from trailers and other behind the scenes footage that a lot of Lady Gaga's scenes were cut. And I think this was a huge mistake, because the film's story, I think, requires her to be a co-lead, not a supporting player. So what we're left with is a complete arc for Arthur and a sort of shaky story for Lee, but what she does is so fundamental to what happens to Arthur that it feels out of balance. What we have here with Arthur in this movie, though, is a very weak character, and I don't mean on the page. I mean the man himself is a very weak man, which I think a lot of people don't like, but I'd argue that he was already a sick person, susceptible to delusions, riddled with self-doubt and self-esteem, and a very damaged childhood. I don't think there's anything fundamentally different about Arthur in this movie and Arthur in the first movie. The only difference is how prominent the Joker persona becomes in each film. I think the assumption that he would continue to grow as Joker was an incorrect one, based maybe off of what we saw in that first movie. We're basically seeing Arthur after he's peaked, which is a tough pill to swallow if you go in looking for a bigger, better version of Joker. Instead, we get a weaker, smaller version of Arthur. And I understand why people are disappointed by that. I think that I can think that it's a more interesting character arc for this movie and still be sympathetic to people that wanted something different or wanted something more from Joker. The Arthur story here comes at the expense of Joker by its very nature. Arthur's only able to tap into what's left of Joker through Lee. The Joker begins to reemerge, but it's a completely codependent relationship. It's kind of interesting because the comic book dynamic, the established dynamic, is that Harley Quinn was always codependent on the Joker, and here we have a Joker who's really codependent on Harley or Lee and her delusion and her vision of what Joker is. And once he breaks out of that delusion, then he's nothing. Harley now has the spotlight, and nobody cares about Arthur anymore. As she says when she walks back up those stairs, that's entertainment. The audience knows what it wants, and it's not Arthur Fleck anymore. My biggest issue with the film was Arthur's turn in the third act to drop the Joker persona altogether and admit that he's just a sad, damaged, lonely person who murdered a bunch of people. That's a massive character switch. And I don't mind if you take that journey with the character as long as it's properly set up. But even on the second time watching, I really can't get my head around exactly why he did it. I think part of the solution lies in the Gary Puddles scene when he's doing his little Southern lawyer scene, which I thought was a really good piece of acting on Joaquin Phoenix's part. And he's brought face to face with a friend of his, a former friend of his, who's asking him, begging him to tell him, why did you do this? You hurt me. You made me scared. You've damaged me for life. And the Joker, or Arthur, can't really play his way through that. He starts to see the actual impact he had on somebody who he once considered a close friend. I think that that is a great factor for that turn, but I don't think it's the only factor or could be used as the only factor. So I think that that's a great scene and a really good performance from Lee Gill, who's the actor who plays Gary Puddles, but not enough to motivate that third act turn in and of itself. There's also the murder of his friend in Arkham, which I think could again be a contributing factor to Arthur's decision, but we don't really get to see much insight on what Arthur's thinking. But again, the idea of, well, here's a person who was nice to me who gets killed because the guards are whipped up in such a rage by what I've been doing in court. Again, Arthur's done so many terrible things in his life. Why would this be the one that spurs the change of heart? And then we have the guards' abuse of Arthur, which directly precedes that courtroom scene. And it is absolutely brutal. I mean, it is consistent physical and psychological abuse. Does that play a part? Again, we don't really get much insight into what Arthur's thinking. Now, I've seen a lot of people commenting on the movie say that the abuse that Arthur suffers at the hands of the guards isn't just psychological and physical abuse, but that it also takes a turn towards sexual abuse when they pull him into the bathroom before they throw him back into a cell. That's not necessarily a conclusion that I jumped to in either of my viewings of the film, but looking back on it, I could see how that might be something that could have happened. I don't know what Todd Phillips' intention was there. If that was the intent in the movie, then I think that opens a whole other can of worms about the problematic use of that sort of abuse in order to motivate a character change, at least if you're not really establishing how devastating that thing is. I don't think that's something you should tap into lightly. I think all of these things boil down to the fact that my main sticking point with the movie is a huge one, which is that the turning point for Arthur's character, really the most critical character development that we have for him, is poorly developed. And that is no small fault of the film. I think it largely undermines a huge part of the movie. It's what I was referencing in my non-spoiler review when I said I actually liked where we ended with some of the characters in the film, but didn't really like how we got there. That's really Arthur's path for me in this movie. I liked what they did with him, but I did not like the way that they did it, because you have to be meticulous about these kinds of things. And I think generally you have to be meticulous about your storytelling. I think the errors that Todd Phillips made in the first movie with how he painted Arthur's character led to the misperceptions of a lot of people and led to a lot of the expectations going into the second movie that then weren't met by other fundamentally flawed character developments. And it's a big reason why I always say that storytelling is so important in movies, because it's not just about the big picture stuff. If you don't plot these things out carefully, then things can get away from you. And it seems very obvious that these Joker movies have gotten away from Todd Phillips, Joaquin Phoenix, Warner Brothers, because I really doubt that they anticipated this kind of reaction. If you're not careful, you're gonna get burned, and I think that they're really gonna get burned on this movie. As for Arthur's murder at the end of the film at the hands of what may or not be the quote-unquote real Joker, that was actually something that I was paying attention to the second time as well, and that specific inmate is referenced in the very first scene of the film. They say, well, this kid's done nothing but smile since he got here, but now he's turning violent. He's obviously somebody who was fixated on Arthur, who felt that sense of betrayal when Arthur dropped the Joker persona, and then became the vengeful spirit of the public who punished Arthur for not filling the role that they wanted him to fill. The big question I've seen posed about this movie is, did Todd Phillips make Joker Folie Deux to vilify or insult the fans of the first Joker film? And personally, I don't think that he did. I think this movie makes logical sense in the overall progression of Arthur's character, and I think that a lot of the misconceptions can be chalked up to errors in plotting that character arc. But I think a deeper question, and one that I would want to dig into a little bit further, is that for the people who do feel like this was a betrayal, or that this was not at all what they wanted out of this movie or what they expected out of the movie, I would honestly want to know what their expectations were, and not in an I challenge you kind of way. I'm legitimately curious, because from my perspective, I came out of the first movie not seeing Arthur as anything else other than dangerous, sad, lonely. I didn't really see a rise arc for him. I only saw a fall arc, because this was a dangerously disturbed individual. And so I'm legitimately curious to know what other people were expecting out of the character, because there was obviously a disconnect there somewhere. There was obviously a disconnect between the people who went to see this movie, the people who wrote it, the people who financed it. There were some real crossed wires here. And I know that people say, well, you don't make a movie just to please the audience. But at this scale, for it to be so out of line with what audiences wanted or expected, something is going on there, and I would really like to dig deeper into what exactly that is. Overall, I don't think that Joker Folie Deux is a terrible film. I know that's not the popular sentiment right now, but honestly, I don't really care about popular sentiment when it comes to my own opinions. I think it's got a pretty strong foundation, but it's critically weak in its execution, which really holds it back and kind of sabotages the whole thing to some degree. I actually think I liked the intentions of this movie more than the intentions of the first movie, largely because I was never really sure what the first movie was intended to be. But, you know, the road to box office, critical, and audience hell is paved with good intentions, and this is a movie that is absolutely going through hell right now. I do think it's somewhat ironic that at the end of this movie, Joker has a complete fall from grace and has everybody walk away from him when he can't deliver to the audience what they want anymore. And we're now seeing in the real world the same thing happen to the movie itself. It's being attacked and walked away from and shunned because it doesn't deliver what the audience wants. And again, that's not an attack on the audience. That's just a fact about the film. It's not delivering what people want. I think it is a noble quasi failure, but I do understand the negative reaction to it. And this is really going to be one of those movies that is fascinating to me. And I hope that it doesn't become a conversation piece in the Last Jedi sort of way where we keep rehashing the same arguments over and over. But I really am looking forward to hearing the discourse, the discussion around this film, not just on opening weekend, but in the days, weeks, months to come. Are people going to reevaluate it? Is it going to keep the same reputation? Is it just about, that first blush of what the movie is versus expectation in the musical and everything else? I think it's an interesting film. I think it's a more interesting film, honestly, than the first movie, but it is risky. As I said in my non-spoiler review, it is risky. Those risks didn't pay off. I think some of them were dumb risks. And we have a movie now that is really, I don't think, what anybody wants it to be, except for the people that love hearing arguments and conversations about movies. So those are my spoiler thoughts on Joker Folie à Deux. What do you think? Have you already checked it out? What do you think about my theories? Do you completely disagree with me? And I know a lot of people do. Let me know down in the comments below. And as always, stay tuned right here. I will be reporting on what looks to be a very disappointing box office figure for Joker Folie à Deux right here on the channel on Monday. And then, of course, stay tuned for more movie news, reviews, box office, all that stuff. Until next time, stay safe, and I'll see you then. Bye.